The room was loud before she even spoke, the air thick with interruptions, voices clashing like cymbals in a storm. But then came the pause, the kind that makes a room hold its breath. Jasmine Crockett looked up, calm but unwavering, and delivered, a line so sharp it seemed to slice through the noise. And that's why your interruptions only expose your weakness. For a fraction of a second, even the cameras seemed to freeze. This wasn't just another exchange. It wasn't just another heated panel or political spat. This was something different. 6 interruptions had come before, each one more cutting, more insistent, more desperate. But this was the 7th. And with it, the tone changed. In that moment, you could almost hear a shift, like a current pulling the audience toward her side. He had tried to dominate. He had leaned forward, cut her off, pushed over her words with the confidence of someone used to taking the floor. Stephen Miller's style had always been forceful, almost theatrical, a strategy of overwhelm. But this time, it met a wall that didn't just hold steady, it pushed back with precision. Crockett's delivery wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was measured, each syllable deliberate, as if she knew the power of restraint. And that's why it landed. The line wasn't just an answer. It was a mirror, turning the spotlight on the interruptions themselves, exposing them for what they were. Not strength, but insecurity. The crowd sensed it. Viewers online would later clip it, replay it, share. It with captions like, "This is how you handle arrogance," and "Respect spoken calmly is louder than shouting." Because the moment was more than words. It was the feel of a table turning, the quiet but unmistakable sound of momentum changing sides. But the question everyone had, even as the clip started making rounds, was simple. How did this happen? What brought 2 voices, so different in tone and purpose, to this single sharp exchange? And why did one stay calm when the other pushed so hard? The answer isn't in that line alone. To understand why it landed like a strike, you have to go back, to the setting, to the build-up, to the tension that made silence golden and the 7th word priceless. And so we rewind. Before that one line shook the room, the stage was already charged. The setting wasn't casual. It was a political discussion where words weighed more than gold, where every sentence could ripple across headlines and timelines. The cameras were steady, the lights unforgiving, and the audience knew they weren't just watching a conversation. They were watching a collision. These moments matter because they're more than exchanges. They're tests of composure, intellect, and presence. Stephen Miller came in with the confidence of someone who's been in the arena too long to second-guess himself. His reputation followed him like a shadow. Sharp elbows, rapid interruptions, an almost relentless need to dominate the floor. It's a style that can rattle opponents and win moments, especially when the other side hesitates. Miller doesn't. Wait. He cuts, he leans, he interjects. Not because he's unsure, but because he knows momentum can be everything in a political setting. His words have always been designed to sound certain, even when the ground beneath them shifts. And then, across from him sat Jasmine Crockett. She didn't match his volume, nor did she need to. Her posture told a different story, one of patience, measured calm, and a quiet kind of authority. Crockett wasn't there to match aggression with aggression. She was there to be the steady line against the noise, the counterbalance to a man who thrived on disruption. She understood something that not every speaker does. The louder someone gets, the more powerful silence can become. The stakes weren't just about winning a point, they were about credibility, about who looked more in control when the moment came. The audience, whether in the room or watching from their screens, leaned in because this wasn't a fair match on paper. Miller was the seasoned voice, Crockett was the one some underestimated, and that made every second heavier, every interruption sharper, every pause more deliberate. As the discussion rolled on, the interruptions began. Not unexpected, but unrelenting. Once, twice, 3 times. Miller's words cut into Crockett's like stones skipping across water. Each time she let him finish or held her ground with a look that seemed to say, "I hear you, but you're not moving me." By the fourth, the pattern was obvious. By the fifth, you could sense the tension climbing. And by the sixth, the dynamic was almost uncomfortable. A man pushing, a woman steady, the audience sensing a break, or a breakthrough, was coming. What made it powerful wasn't the interruptions themselves. It was Crockett's refusal to play his game. She didn't snap back, didn't rush, didn't allow his rhythm to become hers. She stayed collected, as if each cut-in was a brick building a platform beneath her instead of a wall in front of her. It's a rare skill, and it's why the moment mattered. Because when you refuse to flinch, the other side begins to reveal more than they intend. The room didn't know it yet, but it was watching a shift take place. Every second Miller spent interrupting was one less second controlling the narrative. Every pause Crockett took was one more moment claiming the space. And then came the point of no return, the lead-up to a single line that would change everything. Because if 6 interruptions were meant to intimidate, the 7th would do something very different. What she says next changes the tone of the entire exchange. To understand why this exchange mattered, you have to understand the man who kept cutting in. Stephen Miller didn't arrive in that chair as a blank slate. He carried with him years of political combat, a persona sharpened by controversy and confrontation. For some, his name signaled strength and certainty. For others, it carried a weight of divisiveness and control. But one thing was clear. Miller had built a reputation on never letting the other side finish their sentence. He was the type of speaker who treated a debate like a chessboard, but with speed chess rules. Move fast. Dominate space. Never pause long enough to give your opponent a chance. His style was aggressive but calculated, almost theatrical. He leaned forward when he talked, eyes fixed like a predator zeroing in. His interruptions weren't accidents, they were strategy. Each cut-in was timed to unsettle, to throw rhythm, off balance. To those who admired him, it was a sign of strength. To those on the other end, it was a wall built of words, each brick meant to keep them from being heard. This pattern wasn't new. Anyone who had followed his appearances knew the drill. Miller believed the first voice heard is often the one remembered, and so he aimed to be louder, quicker, and more relentless. Whether on television panels, interviews, or private policy briefings, the tactic was the same. Seize control, keep control, and make the other person fight for inches of speaking time. It's why so many of his exchanges ended the same way. Opponents. Frustrated, audiences divided, headlines spinning. There was something almost cinematic in the way he occupied a room. He didn't just talk. He carved through the air with words like blades, cutting through hesitation, slicing over others mid-thought. Even when seated, his posture spoke volumes. Forward-leaning, shoulders tight, the embodiment of readiness to pounce on the next pause. And in politics, pauses are often fatal. They're invitations for someone like Miller to jump in and reshape the moment. But behind the force, there was also predictability. A tactic repeated enough becomes a rhythm, and a rhythm can be read. Those who watched closely could see the pattern. Challenge, interrupt, dominate, repeat. Sometimes it worked brilliantly. Other times it created the very tension that would undo it. Because when every exchange is a test of dominance, all it takes is one person who refuses to play. And that was the variable he couldn't fully control: resistance. Miller's approach depended on a certain expectation that others would either match his speed and get flustered, or retreat and let him fill the air. Few stayed calm in his storm. Fewer still waited long enough to let him run out of moves. It was the reason his style was both his strength and his vulnerability. So, when he sat across from Jasmine Crockett, the stage was already tilted. He was the seasoned debater, the one known to make strong personalities stumble. But Crockett wasn't playing his game. She wasn't leaning in. She wasn't chasing his tempo, and she wasn't biting at the interruptions. Each time he cut across her, she didn't shrink or flare up. She simply waited, watched, and spoke when it mattered. For an audience, this created something rare: tension. You could feel it build with every interjection, every half-sentence sliced in two. And yet, Crockett's calm turned those moments into something else: a slow, deliberate setup. Miller's style was no longer just sharp, it was becoming transparent. The very tactics meant to dominate were being exposed for what they were: noise trying to drown out something steady. And that's where the real conflict began. Because when someone built on momentum meets someone rooted in patience, the game changes. And with each failed interruption, Miller wasn't just speaking louder, he was revealing more. But what happens when the target refuses to flinch? Before the interruptions, before the stare-down, there was a journey that shaped Jasmine Crockett into the kind of voice that doesn't just speak. It resonates. She didn't appear in that chair by accident. Her path was carved by long hours, relentless dedication, and a belief that truth delivered steadily can pierce through any volume of noise. Crockett's story began far from the blinding lights of television studios. Her foundation was built in the courtroom, where every word mattered and every pause carried weight. She learned early that composure was more than style. It was strategy. An attorney's world is one of structure and pressure, where you win, not by shouting the loudest, but by building your case brick by brick. She stood before judges, handled tense cross-examinations, and learned to stay steady even when everything around her moved fast. The law honed her mind, but it also sharpened her instincts. Listen carefully, speak precisely, and never lose the room. When she stepped into public office, those lessons traveled with her. As a representative, she carried not just legal knowledge, but the lived experience of someone who had seen how policies touch real lives. Her speeches weren't hollow performances. They were rooted in understanding, empathy, and an unshakable sense of fairness. That's why her presence carried weight, because when she spoke, it wasn't for effect, it was for purpose. She became known not for theatrics but for clarity, for the ability to cut through noise without raising her voice. This calmness, this deliberate control, is rare in politics. Where others chase sound bites, she crafts statements. Where others lean on spectacle, she leans on substance. Her words are chosen, her tone deliberate, her presence unshakable. And that steadiness, that quiet command, became her signature. It wasn't about dominating a room. It was about owning it with precision. But steadiness doesn't mean softness. Crockett's composure was forged under pressure. She had been challenged, underestimated, and interrupted before. In courtrooms, in legislative debates, she'd faced those who thought volume meant victory. But each time she relied on the same tools: patience, focus, and a refusal to be dragged off course. Even when voices rose around her, she kept hers even. And that calm, ironically, often unsettled those who tried to rattle her. This wasn't just personality, it was training. Every challenge was a drill. Every aggressive opponent was a rehearsal. She knew how to wait out noise, how to strike when it mattered, and how to make each word count. So when Stephen Miller leaned forward, ready to slice through sentences with interruption after interruption, he wasn't facing someone inexperienced. He was facing a mind conditioned to absorb pressure and redirect it. For viewers unfamiliar with her, the moment might have seemed lopsided at first glance, a veteran interrupter versus a younger representative. But beneath the surface, the balance was shifting. Because where Miller's style relied on disruption, Crockett's power came from structure. She knew her facts, she knew her rhythm, and, most importantly, she knew herself, and identity matters. Crockett understood that every time she spoke, she carried more than just her own thoughts. She carried the voices of constituents, the weight of experience, the pride of those who wanted to see someone stay strong in spaces that often try to silence them. That's why her patience wasn't passive. It was powerful. It was a quiet assertion that she belonged, that she could hold her ground without theatrics, and that interruptions were just noise against a steady drumbeat of purpose. So when the debate began to tighten, when Miller's tactics became clear, Crockett didn't shift. She didn't speed up, didn't lean in to match his tone. She did what she's always done, stayed composed, stayed deliberate, and waited for the right moment. And in doing so, she turned each interruption into something else. Not a setback, but a setup. This was the part no one expected. Every cut-in, every attempt to throw her off balance was simply feeding into the tension she could use. Because Crockett wasn't there to survive the noise. She was there to own it. And as the room watched, the dynamic became clearer. Interruption was meeting its match. Because for all his forward motion, Miller had never run into this exact wall before. A calm, prepared voice that refused to bend. And that, more than anything, is why what came next felt inevitable. The debate didn't start like an explosion. It started like a steady drumbeat, but the rhythm quickened with every word. At first, it seemed like a normal exchange. Two voices, opposing views, sharing the same stage. But even before the first full minute had passed, the interruptions began. 1. Miller leaned forward, his voice cutting across hers like a knife through conversation. She didn't flinch. She simply paused, allowing his words to land, and then disappear before continuing exactly where she had left off. 2. This one was sharper, more deliberate. His tone edged with impatience. He sliced through mid-sentence, hoping to disrupt her flow. Again, Crockett waited. It was almost imperceptible, but there was a hint of a smile this time, a quiet acknowledgement that she'd seen this tactic before. 3. The interjection came faster now, like he was trying to quicken the pace, trying to trip her rhythm. The tempo was building, the pattern unmistakable. Each interruption was a challenge, each pause a test of control, and every time she came back, it was calm, measured, almost surgical. By the fourth, the tension in the room was noticeable. Miller's voice carried a slight edge, a hint of frustration bleeding through the controlled exterior. He wasn't used to this kind of resistance. Not loud, not confrontational, but unyielding. And Crockett's stillness was unnerving. Her eyes stayed steady, her hands still, her tone level. She was the quiet in the storm, and that only made the storm more violent. 5. This time, his words overlapped hers before she could even form her second phrase. It wasn't just interruption anymore. It was an attempt to dominate, to drown her out entirely. The volume nudged upward, his confidence pressing harder. But that small smile returned, subtle and telling. Crockett wasn't. Speeding up, she was slowing down. Every pause became longer, every word more deliberate, as though she were letting him write the story of impatience while she held the pen of control. By the sixth, the mood had shifted. The interruptions weren't just tactics, they were symptoms. The room could sense it. The push to maintain control, the insistence on being the loudest voice. Each time he cut her off, it became clearer. The noise was the point, not the argument. And yet every cut-in only magnified her calm. For the audience, it was starting to feel less like a debate and more like a test. How many times can someone be interrupted before they break? But Crockett wasn't breaking. She was building. Each pause, each slight smile, each unhurried breath was stacking tension like bricks. She wasn't retreating. She was preparing. Miller, for all his force, was revealing a pattern that anyone watching could read. Impatience, insistence, escalation. And with every moment, the contrast became more cinematic. Noise against composure, force against focus. Then came interruption number 6. It was the sharpest yet, his voice cutting across hers with a tone that was almost triumphant, as if this would be the one to finally derail her. But the room didn't know what was coming, because after 6 attempts to silence, the next voice would not only answer but redefine the entire exchange. And then came interruption number 6, but no one expected what followed. It's strange how silence can be louder than shouting. When interruption number 6 cut across her words, there was a brief moment where the room seemed to lean toward Miller, expecting him to take over completely. His voice was firm, familiar in its intensity, and for a second it looked like he had the upper hand. But then came something unexpected. Nothing. Crockett didn't rush. She didn't push back. She simply stopped speaking. The pause stretched just long enough to make everyone notice it. Even Miller, mid-sentence, slowed slightly as if unsure. Why, the sound of his own voice suddenly felt heavier. Cameras caught the stillness. Crockett's expression steady, eyes fixed, her posture relaxed but unmoving. It wasn't defiance, it was control. And then she spoke, calmly, almost gently, but with a precision that felt like a blade. And that's why your interruptions only expose your weakness. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They landed like a perfectly timed strike, simple, sharp, and undeniable. The choice of words turned the entire sequence of interruptions into his own undoing, reframing each cut-in as a sign of insecurity rather than strength. For the first time, Miller didn't immediately jump in. There was the smallest flicker, a split second of hesitation, and it was visible. The man who rarely ceded ground had just been forced to stop. The reaction was immediate, though subtle at first. A few murmurs broke the air. A couple of eyebrows lifted around the table. Those watching closely leaned forward because they sensed something had shifted. The power dynamic, until now tilted toward speed and volume, had turned with a single measured line. She didn't gloat. She didn't pile on. She just let the sentence sit there, quiet but unshakable. It's the kind of response that doesn't need follow-up. It writes its own exclamation point. Miller's face tightened slightly, but he said nothing. The pause lingered longer than any of his interruptions. For anyone watching live, it was a small moment. But in the world of politics and perception, small moments can become monuments. Within minutes, clips began appearing online. People replayed the line, framing it with captions, sharing it with commentary. This is how you stay composed. Proof that calm wins. Respect over volume. The reaction wasn't just about the words, it was about the contrast. Miller's style had been all forward motion, Crockett's was steady and anchored. And now, the anchor had stopped the tide. The cameras seemed to notice too. They lingered on her face, capturing the deliberate stillness, the slight rise of her chin, the quiet confidence that said more than any raised voice could. It wasn't just a response, it was a demonstration. It showed that interruptions are only as strong as the silence they can break. For Miller, the pause was telling. His usual rhythm, interrupt, dominate, control, was disrupted. He adjusted his papers, shifted slightly in his seat, and for the first time looked less like the driver and more like the passenger. That one sentence had forced him to reset. Meanwhile, Crockett moved on, her tone unchanged, her composure intact. She didn't dwell on the line. She used it as a pivot. The discussion continued, but now it was different. Each word she spoke carried more weight because the audience had just seen what restraint could do. And that's the magic of moments. Like these, they elevate the speaker, not by force, but by precision. Online, the momentum was building. Viewers clipped the pause before the line, slowed it down, added captions. They called it everything from masterclass in composure to the takedown without raising a voice. For a progressive-leaning, identity-proud audience, it wasn't just entertaining. It was validating. It showed that dignity could meet disruption and win. By the end of the segment, the interruptions had quieted. There were still exchanges, still points to be made, but the rhythm had shifted permanently. Miller spoke with the same intensity, but now there was a hesitation, a split second of calculation before each sentence. Crockett, on the other hand, seemed to grow steadier. That one sentence wasn't just a defense, it was an opening. It's why moments like this live far beyond the table. They travel because they say something bigger, that calm is not weakness, that patience is not silence, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply wait and strike once. That seventh line was the proof. But this wasn't the end of the story. If the room felt the shift, the world outside was just beginning to see it. The clips were spreading, the commentary growing, the energy shifting far beyond the walls where it happened. Because while Miller had spent 6 interruptions trying to own the moment, the 7th created one that couldn't be interrupted. But the internet hadn't even seen the half of it. The line didn't stay in the room. Within minutes, it was out in the world, racing across timelines, group chats, and news feeds like a spark on dry grass. It wasn't just a moment anymore. It was a phenomenon. The clip, 7 interruptions, 1 calm counter, was suddenly everywhere. People clipped it, slowed it down, captioned it, and shared it with words that carried pride and satisfaction. This is how you shut arrogance down. A masterclass in composure. Respect wins. The hashtags came fast, little digital, flags planted by those who saw themselves in her steadiness. Composed power, 7th line, respect wins, stay calm, strike hard. The tags were playful, but they carried something deeper, a sense of validation. For many, it wasn't just about a debate, it was about seeing someone stay grounded when pushed, about seeing patience defeat volume. That's why the clip traveled so quickly. It was more than entertainment, it was a message. Memes arrived almost immediately. Images of Miller mid-interruption contrasted with Crockett's still frame. A faint smile on her face, her eyes steady. Edits popped up with dramatic music, turning the exchange into a mini-movie. 6 times he tried, but the 7th time changed everything. Fan accounts began to add their own flair. Freeze frames, side-by-side commentary, bold text overlays. It became not just a clip, but a template for strength, a way to celebrate the quieter kind of power that doesn't flinch under pressure. News outlets noticed, too. Commentators began to share the moment, calling it an example of composure, under fire, a study in turning aggression back on itself. Op-eds framed it as more than a debate tactic. They called it a cultural reminder that listening, patience, and well-timed words are not weakness. They're strategy. The story was framed less around the argument itself and more around the dynamic. Someone interrupted, someone stayed calm, and the calm voice prevailed. For progressive audiences, immigrant families, anyone who has ever felt talked over or underestimated, the moment resonated. Social media posts reflected that emotion. This feels personal. It's like she was speaking for all of us. Volume doesn't equal truth. It was validation wrapped in entertainment, a small but bright reminder that interruption doesn't have to define a conversation. Resilience can. People weren't just watching, they were participating. They shared their own stories in the comments. Times they stayed calm in meetings, times they were interrupted and wished they hadn't backed down, times they saw someone else take control with nothing but words. The moment gave permission to be steady. It said, without saying, you don't have to match chaos to win. Even platforms outside politics picked it up. Lifestyle accounts, leadership coaches, and motivational pages began reposting the line. They turned it into lessons. When they get loud, stay steady. Interruptions reveal insecurity. Timing is everything. That's the mark of a moment that goes beyond its source. It starts to mean different things to different people. And for Crockett, the attention wasn't just about visibility. It was about credibility. Every share was a signal that people were paying attention, not just to the words, but to the way they were delivered. That kind of exposure matters because it reminds the world that control, clarity, and calmness are not small traits. They're power. But perhaps the most striking thing was how the audience aligned itself. This wasn't just a viral clip floating around. It was a rally point. People were proud to share it, proud to put themselves on the side of the calm voice. In a world that often rewards shouting, they were celebrating quiet authority. It was a shift, subtle but significant. And yet, the buzz wasn't just about validation or politics. Beneath it was a lesson, something worth more than the clicks and the trending tags, because if a few seconds of composure could create this kind of reaction, what could happen when more voices learned to hold steady? This wasn't just viral. It was a lesson. There are moments in politics that fade with the news cycle, and then there are moments that stick because they speak to something bigger than politics. This was one of those moments. What Jasmine Crockett did wasn't just about shutting down an interruption. It was about proving a point that resonates far beyond the walls of any debate chamber. Strength isn't measured by volume, but by control. The seventh line, calm, precise, deliberate, was more than a rebuttal. It was a reminder that dignity has its own power, and when used well, it's unforgettable. The interruptions came sharp and fast, as if dominance were a game of speed. But Crockett's approach was different. She didn't race, she waited. She didn't match the noise. She cut through it with quiet certainty. That's what made the room pause. That's what made millions watch and share. For anyone who's ever been talked over, dismissed, or underestimated, this moment felt personal. It said, "You don't need to shout to win." It told every student raising their hand in a loud classroom, every employee holding back in a meeting, every immigrant, parent translating their truth in a second language. There is strength in patience. There is authority in composure. Crockett's poise turned a confrontation into a statement of identity and pride. The lesson wasn't just for politics, it was universal. In arguments, interruptions are inevitable. In life, people will challenge, cut in, and try to seize control. But what Crockett showed is that interruptions are temporary. The truth lasts. And when the truth is delivered calmly, it lands harder. Miller's 6 interruptions became background noise because Crockett's 7th line became the headline. This is why the clip trended. It wasn't simply that someone spoke, it's that she spoke for something larger. It's why social feeds lit up, why captions called it a masterclass, and why so many people felt like they were watching more than just 2 names trading words. They were watching a reminder that respect is earned in how you hold yourself when others try to shake you. The beauty of the moment is its simplicity. No theatrics, no shouting match, just a steady voice reminding the room who really held the ground. And maybe that's the part worth carrying forward. Because whether it's a political stage, a workplace, or a family discussion, interruption is loud. But truth is louder. So the next time someone tries to talk over you, remember this. Remember the 7th line, the calm face, the silence that followed. Remember that composure is not weakness, it's strategy. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not to meet chaos head-on, but to stand still and let it reveal itself. This wasn't just a shutdown. It was a master class. 6 interruptions. 1 line. Silence. That's all it took for the energy to shift, for arrogance to meet its wall, and for dignity to claim the floor. What started as another loud exchange became something memorable. A reminder that the calmest voice can sometimes be the strongest one in the room. This wasn't just a clip. It was a moment. A moment that said, respect isn't granted, it's earned. And Jasmine Crockett earned it. Not by shouting, not by matching fire with fire, but by staying composed when someone tried to rattle her. That's the takeaway. Here. The louder the noise, the sharper the truth sounds when it's steady and clear. And now, it's your turn. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, if it reminded you of a time you wanted to hold your ground, share it. Let this moment of dignity trend. Let it be the kind of example that cuts through the chaos and says, there's a better way to be heard. Don't just watch and move on. Join the conversation. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What was your favorite part of this exchange? Have you ever had to hold your own against constant interruptions? And most importantly, stay connected. Subscribe to the channel for more moments that matter, stories that inspire, and examples that show how courage and composure win the day. Because there will always be noise. There will always be someone trying to talk over the rest. But as we've just seen, all it takes is one steady voice to remind us who's really in control. 6 interruptions. 1 line. Silence. Now, let's make it echo.